In the last video, I explored hylomorphism as a version of animalism, which we might call hylomorphic animalism. And there I explored the main similarities and differences between hylomorphic animalism and standard animalism. And I also explored some possible advantages that hylomorphic animalism might have over standard animalism. But hylomorphism is both a version of animalism, but also a version of soul theory. So in this video, what I'd like to explore is hylomorphism as a version of soul theory, as a version of dualism. Now, it's not exactly the same as substance dualism, but it is a kind of dualism insofar as we're talking about both body and soul. We've got a duality of something anyway. And so what I'd like to explore in this video are the main similarities and differences between hylomorphism and substance dualism. Let's call them hylomorphic dualism and substance dualism. I want to talk about the main points of agreement, the main differences between the two views, and then I want to explore, like I did for hylomorphic animalism, some possible advantages that hylomorphic dualism might have over substance dualism. Here, our tour guide is David Oderberg. So last in video, we were working through Patrick Toner's article, Hylomorphic Animalism. Here, we're going to be working through David Oderberg's article, Hylomorphic Dualism. Now, hylomorphic animalism and hylomorphic dualism aren't necessarily different views, though we'll see that Toner and Oderberg do disagree on at least one point. We'll talk about this maybe next time or maybe later on. But they're sort of just different ways of looking at the hylomorphic understanding of the human person, either as a version of animalism or as a version of dualism. So let's talk about hylomorphic dualism then. I have identified maybe 3 points of agreement between hylomorphic dualism and substance dualism. The first most obvious point of agreement is that both of them agree that there is more to you than your body. You also possess an immaterial soul. They disagree about how best to understand the nature of that soul and how best to understand the relationship between the soul and the body, but they're both in agreement that you are more than your matter, you are more than your body. According to hylomorphic dualism, like other material objects, you are not simply your matter, you are a composite of matter and form. And like other things, you are not simply other living things, you are not simply your body, you are a composite of body and soul. The second point of agreement between hylomorphic dualism and substance dualism is that they both agree that neither biological nor psychological continuity are alone sufficient to determine your identity over time. You must also continue to possess the very same soul. So, on the hylomorphic worldview, a necessary condition for your continued existence over time is the possession of the very same rational soul. There might be cases in which we've got biological continuity, but not the same soul, and so not you. There might be cases in which we have psychological continuity, but not the same soul, and so not you. You need to have also that further immaterial part in order to maintain your identity. So at least on hylomorphism, it's a necessary condition of your survival over time that you possess the very same rational soul. Now, is it also a sufficient condition? As long as the soul is there, right, then you are there. Well, hylomorphists are split on this issue. They're split over whether the possession of the very same rational soul is also sufficient for your continued existence. Very roughly, Toner thinks that the possession of the same rational soul is not sufficient. If all that was left of you was your soul, it wouldn't be enough to be you. Whereas Oderberg thinks that, no, the soul is not only a necessary condition of your existence over time, but also a sufficient condition. If all you had was your soul, it would be enough for it to continue to be you, or it would be enough to keep your identity going. The third point of agreement between hylomorphic dualism and substance dualism is that they both agree that there is a part of you, your rational soul, that can even survive the death of your body. So not only is this a further immaterial part to you, not only do you need to continue to possess that same immaterial part in order to continue your existence, but they also think that this is the sort of thing that could survive the death of your body. We saw some arguments to that effect from Richard Swinburne in favor of substance dualism. We saw other arguments in Plato and Descartes. And we've also seen St. Thomas's argument for this claim. Well, remember his master argument that he gives, together with his storage and ontological mismatch arguments, which he uses to support premise 2 of that argument. Go back to the notes, go back to the video on that topic. But once again, whether the survival of your soul is enough for your survival is a matter of some debate among hylomorphists. But they do think that the irrational soul can survive, and perhaps even does survive, the death of the body, because it continues to have an operation that can engage in without the body, because it doesn't require the body. It might not even be using the body right now. So those are the 3 points of agreement then between hylomorphic dualism and substance dualism. 1, that there's more to you than your body, you also possess an immaterial soul. 2, that neither biological nor psychological continuity are alone sufficient to determine your identity over time. And 3, that the immaterial part of you can survive the death of your body. But now I want to talk about a couple of points of disagreement between hylomorphic dualism and substance dualism. Here I want to identify 4 possible areas of disagreement. The first point of disagreement is in how substance dualism is understanding the nature of substances. It's the sort of substance dualism part that hylomorphism is going to have a problem with. According to substance dualism, the body and soul are separate substances capable of existing and acting on their own. And you being sort of a compound of both of them would mean that you're a compound of 2 substances, which are somehow accidentally or temporarily related to one another. In the hylomorphic picture, though, as we've seen, body and soul are not distinct substances capable of existing and acting on their own. Even though the soul, the rational soul, can survive without the body, it won't do so, right, as a complete substance. Neither one is a substance on its own. Each part is just an incomplete and complementary part or principle, which those 2 together compose a single substance. So in a way, it's a kind of substance monism in a way, because the one and only substance is the animal, is the composite of both soul and body. Soul and body are not separate substances. They are 2 distinct complementary parts or principles that together compose a single substance. The second point of a disagreement between hylomorphic dualism and substance dualism is that on hylomorphism, the soul is not related to the body accidentally and temporarily as a sailor to his ship, but essentially as form to matter. And so the second point of disagreement is that hylomorphism is going to have a very different conception of how the soul is related to the body, not like a driver, not like someone in his or her car or someone in his or her outfit, right? Not as a sailor to his ship, but as form to matter. This is, right, it's part of the hylomorphic worldview that the soul, like other souls, is related to the body as its form. And here's what Aquinas says in his commentary on Aristotle's De Anima. Quote, there had been much uncertainty about the way the soul and body are conjoined. Some had supposed a sort of medium, connecting the 2 together by a sort of bond. But the difficulty can be set aside now that it has been shown that the soul is the form of the body. As he says, that is Aristotle, there is no more reason to ask whether the soul and body together make one thing than to ask the same about wax and the impressions sealed on it, or about any other form, matter and its form. For as is shown in the Metaphysics, Book 8, form is directly related to matter as the actuality of matter. Once matter is, it is informed. Moreover, although, as he goes on to say, being and unity are variously predicated, in one way of potential and another way of actual being, that is primarily and properly a being and a unity which has actuality. Just as potential being is only a being under a certain aspect, so it is only a unity under a certain aspect, for unity follows being. Therefore, just as the body gets its being from the soul as from its form, so too it makes a unity with this soul to which it is immediately related. So substance dualism has this idea that the soul and the body are related to one another both as sort of agents. They sort of push and pull on one another. And they don't have to be related to one another. They each can exist and act on their own, though there might be certain things that they coordinate in order to do while they're together. Hylomorphism, on the other hand, right, the form and the body are not related to one another as separate things that push and pull each other, that can exist one without the other. The body depends for its being on the soul, like matter depends on its form for its actual existence. Even though Aquinas does say that the rational soul can survive without the body, it still does so as an incomplete part. It still does so as the form of that body. And it only is complete, right, when it is joined to that body once again, if such an event does occur. And so far, hylomorphic dualism and substance dualism disagree on how they understand the notion of substance and whether body and soul are separate substances, whether there are really 2 substances there. And they also disagree about the way in which the soul and body are related to one another. Substance dualism as pushers and pullers, hylomorphic dualism as form to matter. The third point of disagreement between hylomorphic dualism and substance dualism is that substance dualism might have had a difficult time accounting for where the soul is. On some versions of substance dualism, the soul isn't located in space at all. It operates on a body that is in space, but it doesn't itself exist in space. Or some other versions of substance dualism might say that, yeah, no, the soul is in space, but it's only in a particular part of the body, sort of like the driver's seat or the pilot's chair is somewhere in the brain, and that's where the soul is. Hylemorphism disagrees with this on both accounts. It thinks that the soul is present in space, and it thinks it's present everywhere the body is, so in every part of the body, and indeed equally in every part of the body. So here's what Aquinas says on this. This is from question 76, article 8 from his I Answer That. He says, as we have said, if the soul were united to the body merely as its motor, we might say that it is not in each part of the body, but only in one part through which it would move the others. But since the soul is united to the body as its form, it must necessarily be in the whole body and in each part thereof. For it is not an accidental form, but the substantial form of the body. Now, the substantial form perfects not only the whole, but each part of the whole. For since a whole consists of parts, a form of the whole, which does not give existence to each of the parts of the body, is a form consisting in composition and order, such as the form of a house. And such a form is accidental. But the soul is a substantial form, and therefore it must be the form and the act, not only of the whole, but also of each part. Therefore, on the withdrawal of the soul, as we do not speak of an animal or a man unless equivocally, as we speak of a painted animal or a stone animal, so it is with the hand, the eye, the flesh, and bones, as the philosopher says. A proof of which is that on the withdrawal of the soul, no part of the body retains its proper action, although that which retains its species retains the action of the species. But act is that which it actuates. Wherefore, the soul must be in the whole body, and in each part thereof. So to summarize then, what this passage is indicating to us is that unlike substance dualism, hylemorphism regards the soul as present in space. It is wherever the body is. And it's not just present in one part of the body, it's present in every part of the body, in a way equally, right? It is what's making each part of the body be what it is. This is what we get also from the unicity doctrine, is that because each part depends on the form, your soul, then that soul must be present in every single one of the parts. Here's a potential fourth difference between hylomorphic dualism and substance dualism. On pure substance dualism, not only are there soul and body as two substances which interact with one another, what you are is just the soul. Compound dualism says that no, you're both of the substances, soul and body, but on pure substance dualism, you're just the soul. Hylomorphism would surely disagree with this. On hylomorphism, the soul is not the person. Aquinas is very clear and adamant about this. He's arguing against Plato in this course, the way he interprets Plato. On a hylomorphism, the person is the animal, composed of both soul and body. So that distinguishes hylomorphism from pure substance dualism. How do you distinguish then hylomorphism from compound dualism? They have some important points of similarity. They both say that we are compounds of body and soul. They both think that there's this further component to us, and they have the similarities which we described earlier. The main differences between hylomorphism and compound dualism would be the other three differences, namely how many substances, how they interact, and where the soul is. The fourth difference, that the soul is not the person, would be a way of contrasting hylomorphism with pure substance dualism. Okay, so those are the main points of similarity and difference between hylomorphic dualism and substance dualism. I identified some important points of similarity. They're both versions of soul theory, and so they have a certain amount of shared commitments that way. But hylomorphism has a very different metaphysical picture about how soul and body are related, about the nature of soul and body, and so that introduces all sorts of differences between the views. But are these differences, right, ones that we ought to accept? Are these differences that make hylomorphism a worse view of the human person, or do they make it a better? Do they provide any advantages of hylomorphic dualism over substance dualism? I want to say that it provides at least 2, maybe 3 advantages. The particular commitments of hylomorphism, I want to say, introduce at least 2 or 3 advantages of that view over the other version of soul theory, substance dualism. The first one I want to talk about is that hylomorphism seems to better explain the relationship between soul and body. And its better explanation, its understanding of the relationship between soul and body as form to matter, seems to allow it to avoid both the causal interaction and the causal pairing problems that we saw for substance dualism. The causal interaction problem was, as you might recall, that on substance dualism, the soul and the body are substances which act on each other as pushers and pullers. But how could something that is entirely immaterial, right, act on something that is completely material, concrete, physical, here and now, right? They just seem like radically different kinds of things. How could they even have any causal interactions with one another? The causal pairing problem, on the other hand, is not just about how they interact, how something like a soul could interact with something like a body. The pairing problem says, well, wait a second, if, right, these souls are so different from bodies, then how do they get nicely lined up or paired up with particular bodies? So, for example, you might think, oh yeah, when some sort of intention happens in the soul, then, right, there's a causal interaction between that and the body, and so when I form the intention to raise my hand, my body raises its hand. But the pairing problem says, well, why should we expect that to happen? Why, when you form an intention in your soul, why doesn't my arm raise? Why doesn't everyone's arm raise? Substance dualism doesn't have a clear account of why souls are paired to particular bodies and why their causal interactions only affect one body, right? How come souls can't jump around? How come they can't interact with other bodies? This is a worry for substance dualism. They need an account of how the soul gets paired with a particular body. Here, I think, is how hylomorphism gets around those worries. According to hylomorphism, the soul does not act on the body as an efficient cause, not as a pusher and puller, but as a formal cause. The soul is the form of the body, and so it does not act on the body as an agent, but as a structuring principle. And the soul is paired with its body by being precisely where that body is, by serving as its structuring principle. And here's a quotation. Actually, we haven't read this article yet, but this one is from Jason Eberl. Page 485, he describes how he views hylomorphism as getting around these problems. He says, a rational soul and the matter and forms are not two substances which interact. Rather, the composite of soul and matter, a human person, is what acts by virtue of his constituent parts. A rational soul and its material body are thus causally paired, in that a particular rational soul's essential nature includes its being paired with a particular human body as a substantial form. This pairing of form and matter is no more problematic in the case of human persons than in the case of trees or tables. So hylomorphism seems to have better resources than substance dualism in explaining how these things interact. Well, the way of interacting is as formal causality, not as efficient causality, not as pushers and pullers, but having a much more intimate relation. And they're paired to one another because the body depends for its existence on the particular soul there. So you can't have souls jumping around, otherwise you'd have different bodies. And no, I think that probably gets it. It interacts or it causes various things in this particular body. Why? Because it's united to it as its form. Right? So that allows hylomorphism to at least have more tricks for getting around the causal interaction and causal pairing problems. So I think it might be superior to substance dualism in those respects. There's another area I think that hylomorphism might do better than substance dualism within. So the second potential advantage of hylomorphism over substance dualism is that hylomorphism would seem to have fewer epistemic concerns. Now, what do I mean by epistemic concerns? These are the sorts of concerns that I raised for substance dualism earlier on, something like this. If souls are invisible, if they're immaterial, if they're the sorts of things that in principle we could never see, then how do we know that some person does have the same soul over time? We seem to regard other people as the same over time, but if the soul is what's making that person the same over time, and we can't see souls, then it looks like we can never be sure. We never really even have any good reason to think that it continues to be the same person because we don't have any good reason to think it's the same soul. And indeed, how many persons we're dealing with at any one particular time is not something we can determine either, because how many people are in that body would be determined by how many souls are there. But if we can't see souls, then it looks like we can never be sure that we're only dealing with one person. These are some pretty serious concerns for substance dualism. They aren't metaphysical concerns, but they're epistemic concerns. If substance dualism turned out to be the right view, it would be extremely unhelpful. It wouldn't be something that we could use effectively in helping us to identify and distinguish persons from one another. So here's what I think hylomorphism can do about these sorts of problems. First, according to the unicity principle or the unicity doctrine, each substance has one and only one substantial form, and each living substance has one and only one soul. As a result, there could, in principle, never be more than one rational soul in any human body. Because of its commitment to something like the unicity doctrine, there in principle couldn't be more than one rational soul in a single human body. Why? Because that would mean there's more than one substantial form, and so we wouldn't have one body, we'd have more than one body. And so hylomorphism can, in principle, reject the possibility that we could be dealing with more persons than what we think. What about the other epistemic concerns? Those are like the synchronic epistemic concerns. What about the diachronic ones? Well, here's what I think hylomorphism should say. Since possessing a rational soul is what makes something a living human organism, whenever there is a living human organism present, we can be sure that there is a rational soul there. And since possessing the very same rational soul is what makes a living human organism the very same living human organism, then as long as we have good reason to think that we are dealing with the same living human organism, we thereby have good reason to think that we are dealing with the very same rational soul. So what I think hylomorphism can do that substance dualism cannot is that it can track pretty reliably, you might say, the persistence of the very same rational soul by identifying that we're still dealing with the same animal. And it can track the identity of the soul by, once again, tracking the sorts of continuity metabolic functions that would establish that we're dealing with the same animal. And whenever we have an animal, we can be sure that there is a rational soul there. And so while biological continuity isn't what makes you the same over time, and if it isn't a metaphysical criterion, hylomorphism gives reason to think that we can use it as an epistemic criterion. We can use biological continuity to help us determine whether we're dealing with the same person. Even though biological continuity, as we've seen, won't be what makes it the same person, it can be a pretty reliable way of determining that we are dealing with the same person. As long as we're dealing with the same human organism, looks like we should be dealing with the same person, because what makes it the same human organism is the same rational soul. Unless there is a break in continuity there, we should have reason to think that we're dealing with the same rational soul. And so in those respects, I think that hylomorphic dualism might have a few advantages over substance dualism. It does a better job of explaining the relationship between soul and body, which might allow it to avoid the causal interaction and causal pairing problems. It seems to have fewer epistemic concerns because it has the soul has a tighter relationship with the body, and some other principles can allow it to, in principle, determine how many people we're dealing with and whether we're dealing with the same person. So there are some important similarities and differences between hylomorphic dualism and substance dualism, and some reasons to think that hylomorphic dualism might actually be a better version of soul theory. If you are convinced by arguments for thinking that we must have souls, then maybe hylomorphic dualism is the view that you should go for. But only if, once again, the worries for hylomorphism aren't even worse than the worries that we have considered for substance dualism. And so in the next two videos, what I'd like to do is I'd like to first go over what I'm calling the cumulative case for hylomorphism. I want to put together all of the advantages and disadvantages of hylomorphism to try to argue that as a theory of the human person, it actually does very well on several scores. It does very well on the criteria for what would make a good, persuasive, effective theory of the human person. And so I want to talk about the cumulative case that can be made for the hylomorphic understanding of a human person. That's what I'll talk about in the next video. In the video after that, I will take some time to consider what I think are some important objections to hylomorphism. What I want to try to argue is that as long as hylomorphism can respond to its own objections, it might be a powerful enough, it might be a persuasive, it might be an effective enough theory of the human person that we should think it's the right one, but only if it can survive these objections. So that's where we'll go to next. Next two things, the cumulative case for hylomorphism, and some potential worries or concerns for that view.